Welcome back for another episode of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden. My pleasure today to have Neil Oliver back in discussion and conversation. This is the guy, the pundit, archaeologist, author, and YouTuber supreme. Always a pleasure to talk to Neil. We'll be back in a minute with that conversation. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist. Yes, please like the station right now if you can. It helps us beat the YouTube suppression, which we're all being victims of right now. We fight back, though. Resolve to resist. That's what the station is all about. So it's my pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, if I can be so impertinent to say I'm a colleague. I think you're way above me in terms of your achievements, Neil. And it's always a pleasure just to have you on the show again to talk about the issues of the day.
Oh, I always enjoy our conversations, David. It's a pleasure. I genuinely, I take part in a lot of podcasts, but yours is one of my absolute favorites. So,
well, that's so nice of you to say. Thank you. So I wasn't even going to discuss this today because yesterday I wasn't even aware of it. But this is a news release from the UK government, supposedly from February. For some reason, the U.S. State Department, Donald Trump, none of the U.S. media noticed this until yesterday. And this talks about, and I'm going to play this interview with the guy who actually found it, Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, who actually dug this up. We're not sure whether or not this was actually put up on the day it was announced, or they neglected to put it up until recently, because this, of course, completely nullifies all of President Donald Trump's aspirations to get these rare earth minerals from Ukraine, because Ukrainian dictator Zelensky has given them all to the UK in a 100-year partnership declaration. So let's just watch this interview with Tony Shaffer here, where he talks about this happening. Just incredible. Just incredible.
Well, first off, they've got to change the fact that on the 17th of January, the British signed an agreement with Ukraine to have exclusive rights to those deals. Kershaw, this is a battle of dueling narratives. You can go check it out. This is on the British UK website. It talks about this 100-year Ukraine and UK signed a 100-year deal over security guarantees and economic development. So what happened is that I believe President Trump and his team found out that they were being played. So this has become a set of dueling narratives. The BBC just said today there's massive protests here. Zach Andrews just said all the European leaders are behind Zelensky. We are being played. We, the United States, are trying to be signed up to a deal that we provide security guarantees to a economic development deal that Keir Starmer has already signed them up to do. So the first thing it has to do is people have to take a step back and be honest with what's really going on. And so I think what happened here, I don't know the details. It wasn't in that meeting. But Kershaw, the president was trying to play a straight line deal to sign an agreement with them over this mineral rights deal, knowing full well that the British had already signed on this 3 days before his inauguration. So where we go from here is both sides, if this is going to work, if the Europeans really want our help, they're going to have to take a step back and start being honest with the United States about what's really going on.
Now, I thought when I watched that Friday news conference, it was so surreal at times because you have this literal breakdown in front of your eyes. It starts off as a friendly conversation with Zelensky and Trump. Slowly, you have J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance joins the group. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is already there. And suddenly, the conversation becomes very ignited. And Trump is obviously not happy. He had just joked about Zelensky doesn't have to wear a suit. You look just fine in your combat fatigues. And suddenly he's looking at him like, how the hell did you get away with this? And you have no intention of delivering on this offer of rare earth minerals, and you're playing this game with me because you've already signed the agreement with Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the UK. What do you make of this?
David, I looked on at it, and my first reaction is I don't know what to make of it. I suppose my gut instinct was to wonder the extent to which it was some sort of performative, you say this, I'll say that. It was so bizarre the way they all interacted. I thought, is this actually what these people are instinctively and organically thinking and saying? But there are so many things to wonder about. I mean, this idea of a 100-year deal. In what universe does it make sense to believe that which prevails now will still prevail in 100 years' time? That you can sign up to something that lasts for a century? When administrations and regimes come and go in a matter of a few years, and it's also it has that feel about it of the way that there are these the companies out there that sell you gold, but you don't take possession of the physical gold, and for that reason the same ounce of gold can be sold 100 times to 100 different people, even though it's just the same 1 ounce of gold. It's got that feel about it, as though Zelensky has who knows who else thinks they own Ukraine's mineral resources. Maybe the most glaring point is that it would appear that these fabled mineral resources reside in that eastern part of Ukraine that's occupied by Russia. So that Keir Starmer or President Trump or whoever else would really more logically have to be making a deal with Vladimir Putin's Russia about who gets access to what. I've even heard geologists debating that the extent to which these rare earth minerals and metals are actually in a geological condition that makes them usable in the way that I think non-geological people might be assuming. I mean, don't take my word on this. I'm only relaying that which I have read about people who seem to have a much deeper geological grasp than I do. But it's a bit like, given a few million years of geological time and the right kind of conditions and pressure, coal might turn into diamonds. Do you know what I mean? But just because you've got stuff that's on the way to being uranium and lithium or whatever else it is, I don't know that it's necessarily as readily accessible as it might be. But so there's a huge amount to unpack here. But yes, it looks like a bait and switch.
Well, I'm just going to play a brief clip from that incredible news conference, and once again, it's almost like they forgot the entire Washington press corps sitting there in the same room with them because the masks came off. I know Trump is he probably despises Zelensky almost as much as he despises Justin Trudeau. And there's nobody in the world he despises more than Justin Trudeau. But he really had his fill of Zelensky, of him coming out always with his hands outstretched, asking for another 10 billion, please, another 100 billion, please, and we'll get the job finished for you. And Trump is just so sick of this, and you could just see the mask come off, and especially when Zelensky said, "You're going to feel it. You're going to feel it," and Trump said, "How do you know we're going to feel? You have no right to tell us how we're going to feel about this." But here's a brief interaction here, as well as a couple of other anecdotes.
Gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. He's all dressed up today.
if you are not strong...
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military?
We have problems.
And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You don't
God
know
bless.
That.
You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
And seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring people.
Why don't you wear a suit?
Have you said thank you once? This
A lot
entire
of
meeting?
times.
No, in this
Even
entire meeting,
today.
have you said thank
Even
you?
today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
This is what I was told. The president has kicked Zelensky out of the White House. His delegation right now is telling him that he's got to go home.
The office was disrespectful, and I don't know if we can ever do business with Zelensky again. He either needs to resign and send somebody over that we can do business with, or he needs to change.
All right, this kills me, Neil. We've got Senator Lindsey Graham, Rhino from South Carolina. He has been out there every day undermining President Trump's foreign policy, saying, we are standing with Ukraine. We're standing with Zelensky. Suddenly, he does this incredible, absolute overturn. And we can't trust Zelensky. Obviously, I think what happened was Lindsey Graham got word that day what Zelensky had been up to with his rare earth, because it's all you've heard from Lindsey Graham in the past month is all the trillions of dollars the Americans are going to get out of Ukraine from these rare earths. And as you point out, Neil, they always seem to forget that most of these rare earths are in the southeastern part of the country, which is occupied by Russia, and it's going to stay occupied by Russia. I think anybody with any sense of what's going to happen with that peace treaty can understand Russia is not going to evacuate all of the land it's occupied. There'll probably still be a Ukraine at the end of this, but it's not going to go all of Ukraine's way. There's no question about that. But I found this absolutely fascinating that even Lindsey Graham decides, hey, we got rooked here. This guy was double dealing, and how did nobody notice this going on? And I don't know if Trump was just feeling very embarrassed on that Friday and it came out with this hostility. But to me, it's an incredible moment of diplomacy. And I don't think we've ever seen anything like this before. Can you imagine if the cameras had been there at Yalta or Potsdam recording all of these secret conversations? These are the sorts of things that used to be said totally in privacy, but we had the National Press Corps, Washington Press Corps, there watching it all, and I find the whole thing absolutely fascinating.
Apparently, one of the main things that people would not have seen because the cameras weren't at Yalta was the massive amounts of alcohol that were consumed all around, which always amuses me. Huge amounts of vodka and brandy and champagne and everything else. I think they were all very well oiled by the time any agreements came to pass. Another of my gut reactions to watching that event in the White House was it just seemed unseemly for all concerned. I've certainly never seen anything. I don't remember seeing anything remotely like it. We can all imagine that there are heated debates that happen behind closed doors as these characters discuss things, but it didn't. I don't think it showed anyone in a gentlemanly light. It didn't give an aura of diplomacy or maturity. It just had all the attributes of a fight around a family dinner table that was about to end up with people throwing punches. It just didn't seem appropriate for two heads of state and a vice president to be relating to one another in that way in front of the world's cameras. My thought was, what are you all thinking? I thought it's really ill-advised, surely, of Volodymyr Zelenski. Obviously, his English is great. I'm sure he's obviously multilingual, but you could tell from listening to him that he didn't have English at the point where it was nuanced in that, for that kind of highly public, highly inflammatory situation. And I felt that in many ways, you usually see Vladimir Putin works through a translator, which apart from anything else gives them time to think. They're getting time to listen to the question relayed to them by their translator in their own idiom, so that they can, and make sure, and then reply in their own language. You know what I mean? I think that, but I thought, why are you doing this in a secondary language that you're clearly very, very competent in? I'm not saying he's not conversational, but he wasn't quite on that same language level as the other two men. I do wonder, after all this time watching the events of the last several years unfold, the extent to which we're watching theatre, to some extent. I don't know. Volodymyr Zelensky doesn't have any cards left, as Donald Trump kept on saying, you don't have the cards, we would have to give you the cards to play this game. But it's demonstrably the case that Zelensky now finds himself extremely vulnerable between the meshing teeth of two of the three great superpowers on the planet. What is he going to do? Because he doesn't have anything unless somebody else gives it to him. So he's incredibly vulnerable. And we know that even Donald Trump has his backers and his people behind the scenes that have leverage of one kind or another to move the ship of state in one direction or another. The likes of Keir Starmer in the UK, the French President Macron, Olaf Scholz. I don't really see them credibly as people who are actually making the decisions anyway. And we've seen them working already in that way that we learned to spot during COVID, of them working from one script, as though there was a laminated card getting sent through the post every day. These are the talking points today. Make sure you get these words into your speech in this fashion. We saw it with Build Back Better and Window of Opportunity and, 3 weeks to flatten the curve and save the NHS. And there was this thing that these lines that everybody involved was saying. And it's already kicked off again with Ukraine. Cheering for Ukraine is the latest version of, here in Britain, they wanted people to go out on the streets every Tuesday night and bang saucepans with wooden spoons in an act of support. This was the obeisance. This was the kind of ritualized, getting down on your knees and genuflecting to the NHS. That was this performative stunt that everyone was supposed to take part in. And, waving the blue and yellow flag and saying Slava Ukraina is now the new, save the NHS. It doesn't look, it's not real. It's not real. It's choreographed.
It's so much of this is so theatrical. But of course, the Democrats in the States immediately jumped on this to say that this was some kind of ambush and poor Zelensky was set up for this. And in fact, as you point out, we'll get to your slide in a second here, but interesting, the mainstream media in the U.S. dug up people like Susan Rice, who hasn't been on camera now in years. This is an Obama holdover. She was I believe Obama's Secretary of the United Nations, or Ambassador to the United Nations. But here's Susan Rice.
Joining our ongoing coverage, former United States Ambassador to the United Nations, former National Security Advisor to President Obama. Ambassador Susan Rice is here. Ambassador, your reaction.
Well, Nicole, obviously it's a very sad day and an embarrassment for the United States on the world stage. But let's step back and analyze what's happened here. I think there's no question that this was a setup.
Yeah, but as you point out, who set them up? And as you posted on X, this was the same script all over Europe. It's like they were waiting for this. They were reading the talking points, and in this case, posting the talking points. Incredible. I think Trump was legitimately blindsided by this. I don't think there was any intention of this degenerating into this sort of surreal news conference. But I do think the Dems had a lot to do with it, though. I think the Democrats were playing a very, very dangerous game because they are literally undermining U.S. foreign policy in a way that is very close to treason at times, and of course that potentially could be prosecuted. But I found your observation fascinating. Obviously, there is some design here.
Oh well, it surely if it can't be accidental, that's only some of the people that were using that exact form of words at the same time, and there's no way, and that happened over and over again, and it happened before. There's all sorts of fascinating montages on the internet, on social media and so on, where you can see news broadcasters and anchors all around the world saying things like, regardless of the propaganda, it cannot be denied that Ukraine is going to win this war. And that form of words exactly was trotted out by one journalistic mouth after another. And you think, surely, so then you start playing 5D chess with it, because you think, well, surely they realize that it's nowadays, with the way that the social media operates, that this patterning is going to be picked up on in femtoseconds, and people are going to observe this synchronicity. So is that deliberate? You think, do they want us to see that they're synchronizing behind closed doors? Because surely they couldn't imagine that it wouldn't be noticed, if not in 5 minutes, at least in 10. I look on at it, and it makes me panicky at a fundamental level that I've never been anxious about before, because either a very clever game is being played that we're not seeing, or it's this clumsy. And if the people with their hands on the levers of power are this clumsy, then in many ways that's worse than if they're as Machiavellian and sophisticated as some of us like to think. If they really are this lame, we really do have a lot to worry about when it's World War III that's the sword of Damocles hanging over everyone's heads.
Well, exactly. And I was so encouraged to hear Donald Trump lay that on the line with Zelensky, saying, you're gambling with the world, you're gambling with World War III. And of course, I think in November, we may have reached the fevered pitch of that. We came so close to a nuclear war breaking out. And yet most of the national media in Canada, UK, and the US was completely blasé about it. After decades of always reminding ourselves that nuclear war is insanity. Nobody wins. There is only losers. We might not have a civilization or a world after it. And it's something we always have to strive to avoid. But for months, for years, we have been talking like a nuclear war is not only inevitable, but desirable. And I was heartened to see finally a president saying, no, we cannot have a nuclear war. And you, Zelensky, are not going to push us into one. So I think that's good.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you a question, David. Make this make sense for me. We've got Keir Starmer, Prime Minister in the UK, talking glibly about putting boots on the ground. I love when these completely untrained non-military people, jump on the squaddy jargon and stuff. But this boots on the ground thing. Now, 30 seconds on the internet lets you establish that the Kremlin, Putin, whatever, has made it plain that any foreign forces, however they're badged, whether they're called NATO or UN or British or French, whatever, they will not be welcome on the battlefield, in the theatre, because of the way the battlefield is. And America The Trump regime has backed that up and said that cannot happen. The Kremlin is right to say that. So when Keir Starmer and his diminutive chums across Europe echo his sentiments, who are they going to deploy a force against? I don't understand what the two sides of the equation don't balance.
No, they don't. Well, here's Keir Starmer at his warmongering best. I think he uses that phrase "boots on the ground." And by the way, I had boots on the ground in 1996, 97 when I was served with NATO over in Bosnia Herzegovina. That's when NATO's mission really started to go askew, when it just was looking for any excuse to stay as an organization, despite the end of the Cold War. It needed something, and now, of course, it reaches for anything. But here's Keir Starmer, and this guy really gets under my skin. I must say, I can't think, even more than Boris Johnson used to. He really gets under my skin.
First, we will keep the military aid flowing and keep increasing the economic pressure on Russia to strengthen Ukraine now. Second, we agreed that any lasting peace must ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and security, and Ukraine must be at the table. Third, in the event of a peace deal, we will keep boosting Ukraine's own defensive capabilities to deter any future invasion. Fourth, we will go further to develop a coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine and to guarantee the peace. Not every nation will feel able to contribute, but that can't mean that we sit back.
I just have to break in here because does Keir Starmer have a death wish for Great Britain? It's one thing to be a warmonger and to talk about taking on the largest nuclear power in the world. It's another thing when you don't have a military anymore. And I don't know if you ever watched Mark Fenton Productions. He's a really, really good YouTube historian. He recently did a great little video on there being more horses than main battle tanks in the British Army. There are 497 horses, 213 tanks. They would be gone in an afternoon of fighting.
Apparently, the only 40 tanks are able to be deployed. Russia's got 9,000 tanks. As if, I mean, it's so anachronistic it beggars belief. Anyway, and yes, we've got something, I think, like something under 80,000 personnel in the army, and much less than half of that is fighting soldiers. The rest of it is everything else that keeps the army. And at any given point, that 30-odd thousand fighting troops, only something like 25% of that entity is not available to fight at any given moment. Now, I shouldn't have a laugh in my voice when I do it, because every single one of those is a mother's son who is potentially going to be put into a potentially unsurvivable situation at the behest of somebody who seems so disconnected from the realities, or what we all understand as the brutal realities of the situation in Ukraine. He's less of a kind of a prime minister. He's more like the nutter on the night bus that gets on and starts shouting the odds, and everyone's praying that he won't come and sit beside them and engage them directly. He doesn't seem bolted to reality at this point with these proclamations that he's making. This is why I keep turning it back towards you to see if do you have any? Can you distill any logic, any thesis from what he's saying?
Well, clearly the British military has gone the way of the Canadian, because similarly we have less than 65,000 full-time regular force personnel. We've virtually given away all of our Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And this is something most Canadians aren't even aware of. They're gone, blown up on the battlefield. We gave them all away. We just gave 30 more light armored vehicles to Ukraine, or they're on their way, just in time either to be blown up on the battlefield or sold to some criminal cartel, which we now know the Zelensky regime is doing. They're selling military hardware outside of the country and getting money from it after it's been given to them. The hypocrisy and the greed is just incredible coming from this country. But I wonder if Keir Starmer is even thinking in ordinary terms, or if he's even capable of doing that. The Royal Navy was once, of course, the largest navy in the world. It was the pride of the British Empire. It's now barely afloat. It has more admirals than it has ships, which is incredible. There are more air marshals in the Royal Air Force than there are fighter jets, and it has gone in a steep decline under both conservative and Labour governments. There's been no difference. They have both, just as in Canada, conservative governments can be just as bad as Liberal governments and completely ignoring the needs of the military, but very good at pretending they're very, very concerned at the same time. And we saw that 9 years of Stephen Harper, marginally better than his predecessor, but when a push comes to shove, no, it's not there. And what worries me,
we've probably got more giant pandas in Britain than we've got serviceable aircraft carriers.
Yes, you probably do, but it's when these people talk this way, and they really think what they say doesn't matter, and they can somehow put their countries on a war footing when they haven't got the resources to even follow through with their threats. And they expect Putin somehow to nod and say, well, yes, I know you're not really serious, Keir, but just keep on talking. We'll just ignore you. There does come a point where Putin and others are just throwing up their hands and saying, look, if you really want a war, go ahead, make my day. But I don't think you're going to get very far. And certainly that's the case throughout NATO countries. Now, I do think Donald Trump wants to get American troops out of Europe. He has mused about that over the years. He hasn't said it lately. But you have to look at Donald Trump as somebody who has said things for the last decade, and he might not repeat them as often today as he once did, but I think he still believes it. He wants to get Americans out of Europe. I think he would like to withdraw the United States from NATO because he sees it as an organization that is way past its due date. It really fulfills no other purpose today except to incite potential war on the European continent, and God help us elsewhere. It's even looking to Asia now. So do you really think NATO could survive without the United States? Because the United States overwhelmingly pays for NATO, overwhelmingly contributes the largest military resources. Is this a pipe dream for the European Union to say we can sustain NATO without the United States?
Well, NATO is the US, and the US is NATO. Without them backstopping, without them writing the checks and all of the rest of it, anything that a Keir Starmer or an Emmanuel Macron says is, they don't have they don't have that in their account to honour the checks that they're metaphorically writing. They can't do it without the bank of mum and dad, which is at the moment it's Donald Trump and JD Vance. So it goes to something. I think that might even be an unintended consequence of the globalist project, which we can all clearly see that the likes of Keir Starmer and Macron and Scholz and Ursula von der Leyen and all of the rest have bought into and preached and pushed and so on and so on, and it was predicated upon the redundancy of nation states. And in the case of certainly the UK, I can't really speak to what the zeitgeist or what the atmosphere was elsewhere in Europe, but we've been being told that our history is shameful, that our culture is anachronous at best, or just shameful, that our heritage is best forgotten, along with our great grandparents, whose culture you might say it was. But that erosion, that deracination of peoples away from feeling that they belong to anything, and that they're the descendants of, and indeed the guardians and caretakers of something that might then be handed on to coming generations. Having achieved that part of the globalist project has worked, not to mention the uncontrolled, the deliberate mass immigration into Europe, into Britain, which has turned upside down and diluted and irremediably altered the demographic of one nation state after another. For the incumbent heads of state in these places now to play to some kind of patriotism, to try and suggest that their people, their young men in the main, might want to defend something, to defend a notion like democracy, when anyone with their head screwed on even remotely straight can see that democracy, if it ever existed, is a meaningless concept now. I do wonder if it's an unintended consequence of the success of the globalist project in undermining everyone's sense of self and belonging, that now inevitably, when someone like Keir Starmer talks about boots on the ground, and there's even the C word is out there, conscription and the necessity thereof, there ain't no way you're going to get that flag to fly in the climate of the third decade of the 21st century. That ship has sailed.
Well, precisely. I know you pointed this out on numerous other occasions. How can you expect young men or women to defend the realm when you have been telling people that realm is horribly, obscenely corrupt and is racist and doesn't respect women, is misogynistic? And that's how they have sold British history. And yet you expect these same people to fight for this country. You're right. It's absurd.
Look at Germany. I mean, Germany has been prostrating itself to the world since 1945. The young there have been raised in this kind of, if not self-loathing, this necessity for obeisance to make amends for the 20th century. And by now, Germany, which was once, an industrial superpower and, the beating heart of the European economy and a once proud culture, is now emasculated. It's on its knees. Its sense of self, goodness only knows what remnant appendix of what was once the German sense of self still prevails. And that's been a consequence of the abiding philosophy of the last, lifetime. And now we are where we are. We're in this situation where the peoples living in these countries, in large part, they could be living anywhere, and their sense of belonging has been so undermined, if not erased, that you can't motivate, short of coercion. The kind of the spirit of 1916 and the great conscription that put the flower of a generation into the charnel house of Flanders, and God bless, and the tragedy, the unforgivable tragedy of all of that. However, that was possible then because that those people believed in something and belonged to something. And again in 1940, people believed in something, and they recognized a concept like democracy and freedom, and they believed that they had a share, a small percentage share in democracy and freedom and what it was to be British. They felt that they had that. They don't have any. That's all gone. So short of just like they do in Ukraine now, turning up at people's, in car parks and on street corners and dragging unsuspecting lads into the backs of vans and driving them off to the front line. You're not going to get that. It's the anachronistic nature of the saber rattling. I mean, you still have to fall back on these outmoded terms like saber rattling. because we don't even have the vocabulary properly to express the situation in which we find ourselves. When you've got stuffed shirts like Keir Starmer standing behind podiums pretending to be wartime leaders, they don't even fool themselves.
No, that's so true. And when you think of the losses in this war in Ukraine, too, the Ukrainians have lost at least 1 million, perhaps as much as 1.8 million. Those are First World War fatality figures. Those are the kind of numbers you saw from countries like Serbia, or Germany lost 4 million. But the Britain lost less than 1 million. If you include Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and all, it was probably about 1 million. But these are horrendous numbers, and they're also fighting in trenches. But of course, none of this ever gets on the evening news. We don't have any shared imagery. We don't have any shared visuals of this war.
Why isn't this war televised? World War II, Korea, Vietnam were more televised than this. Now, there's got to be a very straightforward and probably very unpalatable explanation for why we're not being shown what's actually happening there. Because I would say it's because what we're being told is happening would be laid bare that is not what is happening. And you're right. I mean, that we can talk in the 21st century about possibly 1.8 million dead. And you're right. Britain lost shy of 1 million. But even at that, Fabian Weir, who established what became the Commonwealth, the War Graves Commission, because he was so upset about the mass graves and what was happening to the dead, he calculated that if Britain's dead were to march 4 abreast down Whitehall, it would take them 3.5 days to pass the cenotaph, marching night and day. France, by the November of 1914, was 1 million casualties down, with 4 years of the war still to go. These countries bled themselves white, and it's only just out of living memory. At Versailles, there were serious conversations had to be had about whether or not France even still existed. There was general acceptance that something was going to have to stand up and be France. But they had lost 2 million down. And there was some serious conversations among these dreadful, ghoulish old men that had stayed safe behind the lines while the young men went off and got turned into pink mist in places like the Somme and Passchendaele and all of the rest of it. But there was conversations that had to be had about whether France could still exist. And yet here we are, apparently having learned those lessons. And we've got a man who's never got his hands dirty, far less bled in a trench, daring to acquire unto himself language like boots on the ground.
It's astounding. But I'll leave us with this, because we both alluded to the fact that these rare earth minerals, which is a concept I don't think I even was aware of 6 months ago, and suddenly everybody's talking about rare earth. But Vladimir Putin had a little offer for the United States.
Мы, кстати говоря, готовы были бы предложить и американским нашим партнерам, когда я партнеры говорю, имею в виду только административные, правительственные структуры, ну и компании, если бы они проявили интерес к совместной работе. У нас, безусловно, на порядок, я хочу это подчеркнуть, на порядок больше ресурсов подобного рода, чем в Украине. Россия является одним из безусловных лидеров по запасам этих редких и редкоземельных металлов. Они у нас имеют.
So there is an offer, and I think Donald Trump might pick him up on that one. And it's interesting, because Canada has a lot to do.
These are the conversations, really. It's the saying the quiet but out loud, as we've learned to say ad nauseum now. But when someone like Vladimir Putin is saying that, what you take from that is the corporatization of and the tokenization of the world and everything that's in it. I mean, let's get down to sort of brass tacks and acknowledge that it's BlackRock and Vanguard that are in control of this situation. They are the best, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, all the rest of it. It's BlackRock and or Vanguard that control. They're calling the shots. They're making the decisions, and it's about economics. All sorts of people are standing ready to launder through the trillions that will be passed off as the reconstruction of Ukraine, and the cash registers will be tinging, for decades to come as the usual suspects. More of these, barely spotted ghouls, will profit from the aftermath of war in the way that these dreadful old ghouls always do, out of sight and largely out of mind. Every blade of grass, every tree in the rainforests, has already got a price on it. The running water, the air that we breathe, the planet that we live upon is being tokenized, ready to be asset stripped and broken up and sold off by BlackRock and Vanguard and the banks and the vast transnational corporate entities. And you catch glimpses of it from a Putin or a Trump or a Starmer. But that's the conversation. I'm glad you played that clip. I didn't know that clip was coming. But that's the kind of conversation we ought to be paying attention to, because there they are, after their proxy war and, 2 million dead. Let's be partners. Let's make lots of money.
Yeah. And after we made billions of dollars blowing the country up, we'll make billions more putting it back together again. And that's
so cynical.
How often has this happened, though? And, just the First World War analogy, people did not know what it was like at the front lines in the First World War. The newspapers printed rubbish. And I remember reading some of these stories. It's the same story day in and day out. Big push, Jaime on the run. It's the same nonsense every day about how the war was going, advancing just as it was, as the generals had planned it to advance.
And the same banks that are still in operation now, the same entities funded all sides in World War I, and they funded all sides in World War II. Now, that trick is as old as, that's been on the go since Adam was a boy. So that they can't not profit. It doesn't matter who wins. The First World War likely happened because the time had come to repatriate and get control of the gold. Because you've got 1913 and the foundation of the U.S. Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor a reserve of anything.
Yep.
These massive cataclysmic global conflicts, they happen because they happen at the behest of the same transnational corporate entities that make money. Where there's, where the blood flows, so does the money.
And that is so true. And anyone who has served in the military has that dawning realization sooner than later that there's somebody pulling the levers here behind the scenes, that sometimes there's no need for that war. We didn't need that war. Certainly, we should never have sleptwalked into the First World War, and we've sleptwalked into so many others. But people leading us, guiding us, those military-industrial complex and the transnationals, as you point out. But no one's going to get me to start cheering for a war with Russia under any circumstances. That would be insanity. And would ultimately lead to a nuclear war, which would lead to the catastrophe on this planet, which would not survive. And I think that's what, if anything, Donald Trump said last week. I say that again. Thank God there is a president who finally acknowledges that nuclear war is a bad thing. It's been far too long since we've had U.S. presidents acknowledge that nuclear war was possible. But it was a horrible, horrible idea, and it should be discouraged at every level. And I'm happy saying that.
I'm just offering my opinion, but I always doubted, really, or very quickly began to doubt that there was anything real circulating in the form of a pathogen that they called COVID. It's just the flu rebranded. Flu disappeared and COVID came in. How convenient was that? But I didn't really think that the entities would have released something that was, as dangerous as they were pretending it was, because ultimately they or their children breathe that air. And for that reason, I've always suspected that really what has kept us safe from mutually assured destruction is the fact that while they like us to live in fear of it, to be absolutely discombobulated by anxiety about the possibility, I don't think they'll do anything that would smash their windows and scratch their limousines, far less put mushroom clouds above the cities that they live in. So I have my doubts. I think that's a game of chicken, with not between superpowers, but between power and the people. And I think what stops them doing it is because they won't do anything that hurts them. They've got too much money to spend and too many views to enjoy from their penthouse windows. They're self-preserving bastards, a lot of them.
That's what it comes down to, doesn't it? Well, Neil, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. Wish we could go on and on, but we'll do this every month like we promised. And it's
absolutely great.
Your analysis is amongst the best out there on YouTube. I don't know anybody else who is so consistently good with analyzing world and domestic affairs as you are. I love your show. I love what you're doing. And sometimes I even forget what a fantastic archaeologist you are, because you're one hell of a great pundit and a great speaker.
Well, David, it's an absolute pleasure. I look forward to conversations with you. I find yours a very open, easy forum in which to just exchange views, and I find myself getting into a mindset where I'm just talking to a friend. So long may it continue.
Great. We'll see you next month then, Neil. And God bless, and we'll see you soon.
God bless you too.
Bye for now. That was Neil Oliver, friend and colleague, one heck of a nice guy who I really enjoyed talking to again today. And it's been a pleasure to get to know Neil. I really have a lot of admiration for this man. And he is exactly what he appears to be. Somebody who is completely honest and completely analytical in the way he understands the world. We'll be back again tomorrow. My guest will be Christine Anderson, European Union Member of Parliament. And I know you're all looking forward to that. It's going to be a great week. And Wednesday, Maxime Bernier joins the show. And we're going to talk about tariffs, Pierre Poilievre, and that next election. Thanks for joining me today.